But once you actually get to know the business and the process power that you just spoke to, you realize it took them years to build up that supply chain, the compliance, the regulatory. At this point, they're now able to reap those rewards and benefits.
One, two, three.
Coming up on The Modern Acre, we're talking a little bonus content in the form of a newsletter.
The Modern Acre podcast explores the latest in business, investing, technology, and sustainability in agriculture, and we're your hosts, Tyler and Tim Nuss. If you'd like to dig deeper with The Modern Acre, be sure to check out our membership community, The Modern Acre Co-op. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Pinion. In today's challenging ag environment, the success of a farm rises and falls based on making sound decisions. Pinion advisors recommend evaluating your farm data regularly to maximize profits and identify threats to your bottom line. If you don't have time or resources, Pinion can help. Farmers have entrusted Pinion with their businesses for 90 years. From ag-focused tax and accounting strategy, legacy planning, and FSA program guidance, to business management, land advisory, sustainability, and more. Explore your options at pinionglobal.com. All right, Tim, I'm super excited that we are launching really two things at once. This is your classic double whammy for content. We are launching a newsletter via Substack, and it's going to be written by a special guest contributor, Jack Richardson. So Jack is going to join us on this podcast, and we're going to do a corresponding podcast with the newsletter to talk all things strategy in ag businesses. I am pumped for this, Tim.
Yeah, this is going to be super fun. We've been friends with Jack for a number of years now and excited to collaborate on this newsletter to really take a deep dive into companies and people that we have on the podcast to really dig into the strategy in their business and take it a layer deeper.
So sign up for the newsletter to see Jack's first edition of the first edition. It's very exciting. He does a full breakdown analysis of Maui Nui and about their pricing strategy, go-to-market strategy that you guys are not going to want to miss. And on this podcast, we dig into some of that and really focus on Maui Nui as a whole and their strategic moat, using a framework called the 7 powers, which are the foundations of business strategy. So we dig into all of that on this podcast. So subscribe to the newsletter. There's going to be a corresponding podcast with every newsletter that he puts out about once a month. And I think you guys are going to enjoy both. So excited to jump in with Jack on focusing on Maui Nui.
Jack, welcome to the pod. It's good to finally have you on. We've been friends for, 3-4 years and been chatting pretty frequently ever since. So excited to get you on the podcast.
Thanks, Tim. Happy to be here.
Yeah, maybe give the listeners kind of an overview of who you are and kind of your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in banking. I've now been in ag tech for about 5 years in strategy, finance, and business development roles. Tim, of course, we used to work together at Appeal. I now work at CNH Industrial on their precision technology strategy team. And I want to share, about a year ago, I started writing on LinkedIn. It was longer form content where I coupled ideas with simple math to illustrate the financial impact of these ideas. These ideas were largely centered on food and ag and ranged from new business ideas to ideas on how existing businesses could expand their business model. And so this is a framework, the framework being analysis, ideas plus simple math that readers can expect from the Modern Acre newsletter.
We're super excited to launch a brand new newsletter. You know, Tim, we've been at this thing for a long time with the Modern Acre. And, the thing that we've done most consistently is put out a podcast every week. And that has required a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to do that and be consistent. That's like the biggest thing that comes up when we talk to people is like, how do you do that every single week? So we've been, I would say I'm going to, pat myself on the back there a little bit. We've been really good about getting podcasts out every week. In terms of other social media marketing channels, we have been less than great. We are very haphazard with social media. We have, of course, Marketing 101 been collecting emails since we started, but we haven't really had any sort of consistent newsletter or email strategy. The most important thing about growing, any brand, any business is consistency when you're talking to people. And so we had the idea, we've seen Jack's writing on LinkedIn, just so impressed with his focus on documenting these ideas, right? And through long form writing, and said, hey, like this could be a really interesting way for us to have another way to connect with the Modern Acre community and do it through a newsletter form that can be shared and viewed and responded to and engaged with. And so we immediately thought of Jack and have been talking in the past few months of like, hey, what could this look like? And really, we've landed on this idea of Jack really owning the Modern Acre newsletter and taking his really unique approach and experience to focusing on companies or people, brands that have been on the podcast previously and taking a deeper dive on them.
Thanks, Ty. So the goal for me of writing this newsletter really is simple. It's to create interesting and useful content for readers that they may potentially be able to use in their own job. To talk further more about that and why I think readers may be interested in the newsletter, I'll speak from my personal experience. If we were to focus on D2C brands, let's say Athletic Greens, not only am I a fan of their product from a customer perspective, I'm also really intrigued about their business. What are their sales, their growth rates, their bottom line profitability? How do they differentiate relative to competitors? And so I found myself researching these questions just out of curiosity, listening to podcasts, Googling, reading through their website. And so in terms of what readers can expect from the newsletter, it really is that approach. It's aggregating publicly available information on a company's financials, analyzing and interpreting to better understand the current state of play within these businesses. And then lastly, to share my own ideas on how I believe these businesses can continue to expand.
Yeah, we're super excited about this, Jack. We've done kind of collaboration with Ariel Patton and her newsletter on Topsoil, and it was really well received by our audience. So excited to kind of like take this a step further and have you really build out your voice and be able to articulate some of these stories, diving deeper into these companies.
Me as well, Tim.
All right, so what's the plan here? Right here, we got to get down to some housekeeping items. So you guys can expect the newsletter to come out about once a month. And when we release the newsletter, we're also going to have Jack on the podcast to dive into it as well. So omni-channel approach here. Okay, we're going to hit you with the newsletter, and we're going to hit you with a podcast, similar to what we're doing with Ariel, and we'll continue to do with Ariel. So, and this is really going to be focused on what Jack said. Focusing on strategy, focusing on business models, focusing on new ideas to grow these different businesses. And on the podcast, we're going to create a framework around strategy that is not our own, because there's some really good frameworks out there. And so one that I'd like to introduce to everyone is called the 7 Powers. These are the Foundations of Business Strategy by Hamilton Helmer. So it's a book called 7 Powers. Tim, you wouldn't know since you don't read, but book on business strategy. And so there's these 7 powers that, to be honest, it takes a little time to digest each of these and what that means and what businesses have them, what they don't, and why. But I think it's a really good framework that we can begin, Jack and Tim, to start talking through more. And as we even get more equipped on these powers, so can our audience, especially as it relates to food and agriculture. So I hope that this can be a really good opportunity for all of us to learn together and dig in on some of these strategy topics that, there's not really another format to do that. So really quickly, again, don't feel stressed about it. We're going to link the book. I'll link a blog post that digs into the 7 powers. So don't stress if you don't automatically absorb these immediately, but the 7 powers quickly. So power 1 is scale economies. This is a business where per unit costs decline as volume increases. So the benefit is reduced costs, and the barrier to entry is prohibitive costs of share gains. Power number 2, network economies. This is a business where the value realized by a customer increases as the user base increases. This benefit is the ability to charge higher prices or monetize due to additional value created. The barrier is it's hard to gain market share as users don't want to switch due to the lower value provided. Power 3, counter positioning. This is a business that adopts a new, superior business model that incumbents cannot mimic due to the anticipated cannibalization of their existing business. The benefit is lower costs and or higher prices due to a more valuable product. Barrier to entry is cannibalization of existing business. Power number 4, switching costs. This is a business where customers expect a greater loss than the value they gain from switching to an alternative, the benefit being the ability to charge higher prices for the same product. The barrier to entry is competitor has to compensate the customer to switch. Power number 5, branding. This is a business that enjoys a higher perceived value to an objectively identical offering due to historical information about them. This allows them the ability to charge higher prices due to perceived higher quality or reduced uncertainty. The barrier to entry is the significant time and uncertainty needed to build a brand. Power 6, cornered resource. This is a business that has preferential access to a coveted resource that independently enhances value. This provides the ability to charge higher prices, reduce costs, or create better products due to access to a cornered resource. The barrier to entry ranges from property and patent law to personal preference, for example, retention of key talent. And the last power is Power 7, process power. This is a business whose organization and activity set enables lower costs and or superior products that can only be matched by an extended commitment. The benefit is improved product and or lower cost due to superior process. Barrier to entry is the significant time and or investment needed to create the process. So these 7 powers, companies that sustain profits for the long term, have one or multiple of these powers is critical to business success over the long term is really the idea around these 7 powers.
Thanks for walking us through that, Ty. Excited to kind of look at businesses through this framework. I think a lot of times on the podcast, we're learning more about the individual and their background and that high level look at their business. So to actually like take a deep dive and do in-depth looks on like, what does the strategy look like? What's their competitive advantage? Like, are they going to win long-term? I think is going to be super helpful to have Jack dig into that.
All right, Jack, moment of truth here. So the first newsletter was on Maui Nui. Go subscribe to the newsletter. The link is in the show notes. You can read Jack's first newsletter focused on Maui Nui. Jack, why don't you remind us quickly who Maui Nui is? What do they do? And then maybe we can dig into the powers that they have as a company.
So Maui Nui Venison is, as you can expect, a company based in Maui that is a vertically integrated player that both harvests the wild axis deer on the island and has created a D2C channel and brand that sells, quote unquote, the healthiest red meat on the planet. So I believe the two of you interviewed Jake from Maui Nui last year. It was super interesting for me to listen to that episode. And I'm really excited about overlaying learnings I've had about their business with the 7 powers. Maybe one caveat on the 7 powers. I know both of you are fans of the podcast Acquired, as am I. I think they do a great job analyzing the business they're looking at across the framework of the 7 powers. The one caveat I have here is this newsletter, while it will be focused on food and ag, is generally going to be focused on relatively earlier stage companies. The podcast Acquired talks about household name companies, Costco, NVIDIA. Well, maybe NVIDIA is not household for everyone. Walmart, Amazon. The companies we're going to be looking at are, let's call it more 7 to 8 figure top line brands. Now, despite them being relatively early stage, I still think it's a valuable framework, that of the 7 powers, to think through and debate which ones these companies we think are on the path to achieving at least one of these 7 powers.
Yeah, super good call out. Thanks for bringing that up. If NVIDIA is not a household name, I think that's a problem. I think a year ago, you have an excuse. If you are not familiar with NVIDIA, then there's going to have to be a separate Acre Insights episode on that. But no, I'm just kidding. All right. So Jack, thanks for that caveat. Let's jump in. Seven Powers, Maui Nui, you dug into their business model. They sell direct to consumer venison to customers, focused on, again, this invasive deer population on the Maui Island. It's an awesome story, by the way. So be sure to listen to that episode if you haven't already. What powers come to mind? Which ones do you think Maui Nui has the most of?
So I believe Maui Nui has two of the seven powers. I'm going to share them one at a time. The first one is cornered resource. Cornered resource, this should sound obvious if you're fairly familiar with the company. They are the only vertically integrated player that is both harvesting and selling the invasive axis deer on the island of Maui.
No, I think this business is super unique in that sense where like if you want to buy wild axis deer, there's really like one place to get it. If you're like living in the States, if you don't actually like live on Maui and can hunt it yourself, like if you're a consumer, pretty much anywhere you got to go through this company. So exceptional moat.
I think the other key piece that we dig into on the interview with Jake is just the regulatory piece of this. Right? Like it's a cornered resource, not because they got some stroke of luck, but it's because they went through the regulatory process, because to actually hunt and harvest a wild animal, it's not something that you can just like go pick up and start tomorrow. So they had to get the regulatory approvals. And Jack, I would add on this one, this power is almost combined a little bit with process power as well. Because I think for them to really like achieve, they almost needed process power to get the cornered resource, if that makes sense, because they had to develop the regulatory compliance with the USDA to harvest these. And then they had to develop their system and process that Jake gets into our podcast about how these guys are like CrossFit athletes mixed with snipers, mixed with rally car drivers. And the fact that they have to, first of all, locate the deer, go find them in the middle of the night when they harvest. They have to harvest them in one shot to comply with the USDA standards. And then they have to harvest that animal using mobile processing in, I believe it was under an hour, Tim. So to achieve this cornered resource where they are the only ones that can sell this type of deer, they also had to have an incredible system and process behind that. So I think these two kind of come together in tandem to create a huge moat, a huge operational execution moat.
Ty, it makes me think of the adage. It goes something along the lines of an overnight success over the course of 10 years. And because from my opinion, Maui Nui is kind of blown up over the last year or two. They advertise on the Huberman Lab. Jake's been interviewed with Tim Ferriss, Peter Attia. But once you actually get to know the business and the process power that you just spoke to, you realize it took them years to build up that supply chain, the compliance, the regulatory. At this point, they're now able to reap those rewards and benefits of having that corner resource and process power.
Yeah, if you think about what it would take for another company, like to start from scratch and say, hey, I want to compete with Maui Nui. There's such a high barrier to entry. And that's the point of these seven powers.
All right, Jack, what's the second power law you were thinking about with Maui Nui?
Okay, the next power law for me is branding. Now, branding for a couple reasons. If I had to think of one word that describes Maui Nui Venison, it's aspirational. It is an aspirational brand. I want to be attached to that brand. And with that, I want to share it with family and friends. I've been buying their venison sticks for the last few months. Not only do I love the product, but I love having a cool conversation topic to share with people. And here's one true and tried way to determine whether a company has branding power. You look at their prices. And this is a sneak preview to give readers and listeners a bit of a sneak preview of what the newsletter will entail. I include a price comparison of Maui Nui to another very premium regenerative D2C meat supplier, that being Force of Nature. And in the newsletter, you'll see that despite Maui Nui and Force of Nature both being top-notch players, Maui Nui has over a 50% price premium relative to Force of Nature.
That's absolutely crazy. Yeah, the venison is not cheap, right? So it's really high quality. They have an amazing brand aesthetically. they have an amazing brand from a story perspective. Like Jake obviously does a great job sharing that story. It was he and his wife, and it took years, like you mentioned earlier, to build this. And just the backstory of like he fell in love with this deer and the why behind the business, right? Like, I think at its surface, you're like, oh, they're harvesting deer. That kind of seems like inhumane, but you dig into the story behind it, and it actually is one of the most humane harvesting processes for meat anywhere, right? Like, and he talks about that on the podcast. And that was really inspirational for me. And one of the reasons that I kind of fell in love with the brand as well was like, it's solving multiple problems. I love when stuff happens like that, right? Where there's this massive overpopulation problem. It's a problem for the inhabitants of Maui, for the landowners in Maui, and take care of this problem overpopulation. And you do it in a humane way, and then you provide this really healthy meat. We haven't got into that piece of it, of how they've done nutrient density testing, and the macronutrients are like off the charts because it's just this animal that has no stress on it, right? It's just a wild animal roaming free. And the lack of stress actually improves the macronutrients. And we've seen a few studies like expressing this of, the factory farming system, and the stress put on those animals is brutal. It's terrible. And the macronutrients are down as a result of that, stress. So, I mean, again, I'm telling the story, right? I'm telling the brand. I'm passionate about it. And obviously I'm not the only one.
Yeah, I echo your thoughts, Jack. I've purchased Maui Nui venison before, and it's like something you want to like tell your friends and family about. Like, the story is so cool. Like, if I buy a pack of ground grass-fed beef, it's kind of like you're buying high quality stuff, but you're not like really like, oh, you need to buy this beef. And there's this whole backstory. Like, Maui Nui has this like super compelling story that you can tell to friends and like really gets you passionate as a consumer. So like, that's been something that like very few brands do for me personally, where I actually like want to talk to people about it. And it's a huge talking point.
I'll share one other insight of why I believe Maui Nui has both branding power and kind of related to that, the price premium. They have a very unique subscription model. And I dig into this in the newsletter. They have the Ohana box, which is limited to 8,000 subscribers. So you go, 8,000, they're capping their revenue growth. Well, one, they are only sourcing their venison from the invasive axis deer. And they talk about, they don't have revenue goals. They have, I believe they use like management goals to restore the local ecology. But two, they could have kept that number 8,000 internally. I believe they promoted to create the illusion of scarcity, which only furthers into the notion of creating a price premium. And in describing that point, I think of the strategy of different luxury brands. Folks like Hermes, which before I moved to New York 2 years ago and happened to live a stone's throw away from an Hermes store, I thought it was pronounced Hermes, but that's for another talk show. Hermes limits the production of their most popular bags, the Birkin and the Kelly bags. And by Maui Nui, despite their production constraints being real versus artificial in the case of luxury, these other luxury brands, it creates a sense of FOMO and a sense to act now, and for subscribers not only to subscribe sooner rather than later, but in my opinion, more likely to continue being a subscriber and not churn.
Totally. Yeah, I love your analysis of that in the newsletter. I think is really fascinating, creating that scarcity. One last point I have on the powers is kind of similar. Like, I think another supplemental power to branding is counter positioning. I do think that they position themselves as a alternative to traditionally sourced meat, right? And I think that builds into their brand and obviously builds into their process power. So these things play together as we understand, right? But I think them being able to say, this is your standard. Like, this is when you go buy meat at the store, typically 9 times out of 10, it's factory farmed in a CAFO environment, putting high stress on the animal, oftentimes pumped with antibiotics. And we are the complete reverse of that. We are harvesting a wild animal in a humane way. I think that hits counter positioning.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ty. Jake talked about a lot of vegans that have historically like been opposed to meat due to the ethical reasons, like are actually coming to Maui Nui, and like this actually resonates with them and makes sense. So like being able to attract a consumer that's on a totally different end of the spectrum, I think is a really unique position that Maui New has. Well, as we wrap this up, Jack, it's been awesome to have you on. Excited to do more of these, excited for the newsletter. How can our audience connect with you and everything you're doing personally, as well as subscribe to the newsletter?
Thanks, Tim. The newsletter can be found on Substack, simply the Modern Acre newsletter. I'll also be sharing the newsletter via LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And closing remarks on my end, I want this newsletter to be interesting and useful for readers. So please let me know any comments you have, and I will incorporate those going forward.
Hope you guys enjoyed the first of the strategy series of the Modern Acre podcast, talking about our new newsletter with Jack. Really excited about this, Ty. Just more content for the people.
Yeah, no, it was a ton of fun digging into the 7 powers, Tim. I'm excited to really grow in that business strategy framework alongside our listeners, right? Like, I love how we have Ariel's podcast focusing on just the different fundamentals of agriculture, and with Jack focusing on business strategy and how that relates to ag businesses. So I love this. Super excited for the next edition. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button on our Substack. The link is in the show notes, and make sure you're subscribed on this podcast, whether it's Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We're coming to you everywhere, just trying to bring that content, make sure we are accessible to the people. So appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll be back next week with a fresh new episode.